Hi, Vicky. Thank you for joining me today. If you could please start with introducing the Survivors Trust and your role within the organisation.
Yeah, no problem. So we're a national membership organisation for specialist rape and sexual abuse support services. It's actually our 20th anniversary as a registered charity this year, but we've been going a bit longer than that. So all our members, we've got 120 across the UK and Ireland, and they're all specialist voluntary sector organisations working with survivors of rape and sexual abuse. Between them, they offer support for all survivors, so all genders, all ages, of all forms of sexual abuse. Generally, they're sort of small to medium-sized charities and community interest companies. And we exist because we wanted to make sure that they are properly represented, supported, funded, and recognised. I mean, they do such a fantastic job, but because they're so small, they quite often can get overlooked. So we're kind of there to big them up and give them that networking and that representation on a national level. So within the Survivors Trust, I'm the operational support manager. So my main responsibility is to work with our member agencies. So we organise meetings, forums, workshops, give one-to-one support, help with policies, any queries, any issues they've got going on, and any issues they raise as well. I'm responsible for feeding them back to the other agencies that we work with. And in addition to that, in addition to our work with our member agencies, we campaign for greater awareness of and responses to rape and sexual violence. So we're always campaigning to the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office, various sort of government departments and statutory organisations. We want to make sure that it is always being talked about and work is always being done to help combat it and to help support survivors.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important what you said about it. Keep talking about it.
Yeah.
Definitely, and that's something that we obviously at Urban want to continue and help that conversation as well. You mentioned sort of 120 organisations in terms of the charity that obviously the Survivors Trust is the umbrella representation of. Who else does the Survivor Trust predominantly work with and partner with? So, for example, we worked with you in terms of the accreditation. Do you have any other organisations that you tend to work with as well?
So yeah, we work closely. There's two other national member organisations. That's the Male Survivors Partnership and Rape Crisis. So quite often we'll join together with them to raise awareness of the big issues and to give feedback to the government. We have regular meetings with the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office, NHS, Ministry of Defence, the police, other big organisations as well. We have this sort of two-way feedback going on. So we let them know about current trends within our sector, concerns that we and our members have, things that we're hearing from survivors, and they let us know about new developments. They get our feedback, they get stats from us as well. We share data on sort of service demand, all that sort of stuff. And
Really
like I said
invaluable,
before,
really, yeah, really
yeah,
invaluable, that two-way with, as you said, the police and the NHS.
yeah,
You
definitely.
guys see one side, they see another, and collaborating together is super important.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. We've got a specific project with the NHS, which is called Check With Me First, and we're supporting frontline healthcare professionals who might be working with survivors.
Mm.
So that could be anyone from a gynecologist to a dentist, and it's about that awareness of what someone might have been through and how traumatic they might potentially find an appointment. So it's about helping them to work with people and make that just easier for someone who's going through that. Another big thing we do as well is our training. So we offer an accredited diploma for independent sexual violence advisors and the people who manage those services. And we do training for all different organisations where we're always getting people getting in touch with us to do staff awareness training and workshops and to help raise that awareness within their own organisations as well.
Yeah.
And on a similar theme, we work with universities who are researching into the sector. We were involved in the Prosper study, which is about, again, the services that are needed within the country. We were involved in the independent inquiry into childhood sexual abuse. We work with the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority. We work with the Association of Child Abuse Lawyers. So we're always trying to network
Yeah,
and build those
everywhere.
relationships.
Yeah. Making sure that you've got, yeah, making sure that you've got spreading the awareness and making sure you've got the right people on board. That's
Yep,
fantastic.
absolutely.
And I think there are 2 points there that you mentioned that we'll come back to. So one was obviously the training, which we'll come back to in a minute, and also that awareness of that one-to-one interaction in an appointment. So those are two really important points that we'll get into a bit more in detail.
Yeah.
In terms of your resource and the Survivors Trust, what is the best way to get in touch with you guys if someone wants to speak to one of your agencies?
So we've got two websites. We've got a general website that has information about us and our member agencies. And there's a feature on that where you can search for support in your own area. So you put your own postcode in and it will bring up the agencies that are in that area and information about them, links to their websites. That website's also got details of our training. It's got information and research around sexual violence, fundraising. It's also got a section on survivor stories. So that's where survivors get in touch and share their stories. So what's happened to them and what's helped them as well. So that's a really kind of inspirational area. And we've also got a specific resources website, and that's got sections on it exploring specific areas associated with the effects of rape and sexual abuse. So things like dissociation, trouble with self-esteem, problems with intimacy, and each of those sections has advice on how to work with that, how to help yourself, where to access support, and that was developed alongside survivors. So that's a proper sort of first-hand account and really useful tips and resources there. And that's for survivors and for the people who support them.
Yeah.
And the other thing I should mention is we run a helpline, a text service, and a live chat service as well. So people can get in touch and speak to someone or text if they prefer that. And that offers support and signposting to survivors and again to anyone who supports them.
Amazing, amazing. And so there is quite a lot of material there, which is self-serve. So if someone didn't want to speak to someone, they've got the resource there that they can just have a look themselves, educate themselves. As you said, not necessarily a survivor, but also someone who supports survivors or may work with survivors themselves or be in the entourage, which I think is super important as well to highlight. It's not just for survivors, it's for people who help and support them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Amazing.
we get quite a lot of contact from people, as do our member agencies, from survivors and again from the supporters who maybe haven't disclosed what's happened to them for years, maybe even decades. So they're sort of it's that first tentative looking at the support available. So we want to make it as accessible as possible, and as many forms as possible.
Perfect. Yeah, I think it's also, as you mentioned, the different formats of getting in touch. So there's the text, there's the phone, there's the chat, there's the website, the self-serve, very different channels that people can use to get in touch or to get, the first help, whether it's self-serve and reading or actually speaking to someone.
Yeah.
Great. So what would you say the key pillars are and values that the Survivors Trust embed within your work and the initiatives that you guys work on?
I think our two main pillars are one, that rape and sexual abuse are wrong, and that society as a whole needs to take responsibility to end them. And the second one is that all survivors should be listened to, they should be believed, and they should be treated with respect. All survivors should be able to access support that's tailored to their needs, and that's accessible and that's available when they need it. So, with regard to the first one, it's about raising awareness of the prevalence of rape and sexual abuse. It's about ending victim blaming and rape myths, which we still see all the time in the media. It's about supporting education and early intervention. And it's about calling out inappropriate behaviour and demanding action from the government and relevant authorities. So a big ask, obviously, but we believe that everyone is responsible for that.
Yeah.
And the second part, about making sure survivors get the support they deserve, it's about promoting the work of our member agencies. We want greater recognition for the amazing work they do. We want sustainable funding. And we want more help for the difficulties they face and the demand for the services. Demand is higher than ever. So it's a problem that is not going away. And we don't want survivors to be on a waiting list. We don't want them waiting for that support. We want them to be able to get in there and get the support they need.
You mentioned earlier training that you do with organizations. What training opportunities do you offer to individuals looking to increase their awareness on safety matters?
Loads. I'll give you a little breakdown of what we do. So we have sexual harassment awareness and prevention. We have information on childhood sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation, how to handle disclosures of sexual violence or complaints about sexual harassment. We'll do awareness on the legal side of things, so things like pre-trial therapy, general understanding of rape and sexual violence, and the effect it has on people, and trauma. We do workshops and training on consent, how to eradicate bystander behaviour. We have specific training on how to work with male survivors or vulnerable people. And we have training for professionals as well in how to sort of develop a trauma-informed workplace. We do things like mediation and negotiation skills. We do safeguarding training. So most of the stuff that we run for organisations, we can also run for individuals as well. They'll jump on a session with other people. And we're always happy to run bespoke workshops as well. If someone tells us what they want and who it's aimed at, we're really happy to work with them on that. Developing new training. We also work with our survivor forum as well, it's a group of survivors, and we run any training past them and they'll give their feedback on that from their perspective. And loads of our member agencies run training as well, really sort of expert specific training. So if there's something we don't do, we can probably direct you to one of our members who will be able to help you out.
So if someone, who's watching this video did want to educate themselves a bit more and, receive sort of more formal training on an individual level, is it just a question of getting in touch on the website and discussing what they're looking to learn about?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you do go to our website, our training email's there, and it'll be email our training team and see what they can help you with.
Perfect, amazing. So you mentioned trauma there. So I'd like to go on and talk a bit more about that. How does the Survivors Trust define trauma?
Trauma, it's one of those terms, unfortunately, that gets bandied around quite a lot at the moment, and I don't think everyone who uses it understands it. But it's the lasting emotional response to experiencing a really distressing event. So if we experience a traumatic event where we feel helpless, or in fear for our lives, that's understandably, it's going to harm our sense of safety, our sense of self, and our ability to regulate emotions and navigate relationships. So we talked about a traumatic event. It can be anything. It can be a single event. So something like a car crash, violent assault, a natural disaster, and it can be recent or non-recent. It could have happened years ago. But it could be also an ongoing long-term stress. So examples of that might be ongoing childhood neglect, sexual or physical assault within a relationship, something that's ongoing like that. And it's a normal response to abnormal events. I think that's a really good way of looking at it. Yeah. So it's something where we experience like something like that. Of course, our body's going to react to it. Of course, our mind's going to react to it. But when the effects go on over a period of time, that's your trauma response. And it comes from the fear center within our brain kicking in, and in some cases maybe being overwhelmed and interpreting further events as being fearful.
Okay. And why is it important to be trauma informed?
So being trauma informed, it's about understanding trauma and the effect it has on people. In a nutshell, it's a way of understanding and supporting people who experience trauma. So a big part of it is recognizing that someone's behavior might actually be a response to the trauma they've experienced. And when we talk about working with someone in a trauma-informed way, it's about looking at what's happened to someone rather than what's wrong with them. And it's about looking at trauma in a more holistic way within the context of the whole person. So we're not using trauma as like a clinical label or a condition. We're understanding it as a common and understandable outcome of exposure to a traumatic event. So it involves acknowledging the impact of traumatic experiences, recognizing possible signs and symptoms of trauma, working to avoid re-traumatizing that person, and then integrating all of that into sort of our policies, our practice, and the way we work. So obviously our organisations, they work directly with survivors who've experienced trauma, and obviously they need to work in a trauma-informed way. They do it all the time. They're pretty much experts on that. But all organisations can and should be more trauma-informed. It's not about being an expert. It's just about having that understanding and that respect for people, and being willing to create a safe and supportive environment for everyone.
Amazing, amazing. So you mentioned organisations needing to be trauma informed. As you're aware, we collaborated with the Survivors Trust. So Urban went through the process of having our processes reviewed, our protocol, and we managed to acquire the civil level of trauma informed accreditation. Could you explain a bit about that process? What's it like reviewing a company's policies and protocol, and what are the steps needed to become a trauma informed employer?
Yeah, okay. So the way we do it, it's via self-assessment. So we'll be asking for examples of where an organisation meets certain competencies. And in a lot of cases, in the first instance, they'll be sending us paperwork and records and examples. And then we'll follow that up with interviews and emails and eventually site visits as well. There's no time limit on it. So we're really keen to work at that organisation's own pace. If they're not reaching a certain level, it's not a fail. We will work with them to achieve the level they need, whether that's help with policies, training, coming down and working with staff. We'll work with them to do whatever they need for that. We have bronze, silver, and gold levels, and we ask organisations to work their way up from bronze. So that starts with a review of the policies and the procedures in place. So you've got the groundwork there. But we're not doing it as a tick box exercise. So it's not just a case of having a certain policy.
Yeah.
We're looking at the reasons behind that, how you've adapted it to the people you work with. We're looking for an understanding of trauma. We're looking for examples of sort of safe recruitment, and regular reviews and willingness to adapt in line with new information and guidance. So good information sharing is one we look at as well. Big emphasis on the workplace culture for us. So staff support and welfare, how complaints and disclosures are dealt with, that understanding of trauma, not just the effect on the person experiencing it, but for everyone who works with it as well. We look for things like good links with external agencies and other sources of support. And finally, we look at management and governance as well, so that the people who are responsible for the decision making and the policies have that understanding of trauma, and that trauma-informed values are incorporated into all the decisions. So we want to see sort of the head people, whoever they are, whether they're governors or managers or directors, that they're aware of what's going on at ground level as well, and they're aware of any complaints, they're aware of areas that need to change, and that they're committed to doing that as well, for the sake of customers, clients, and workforce, of course, as well. So we don't look for any single particular techniques or checklists. What we are looking for is that thought has gone into it for that individual organisation. So we're looking for evidence that they've adapted something in a particular way because it needs doing, and it's to fit their client base, or the need or the demand in the area, or demand from staff as well. So yeah, it's quite intuitive and insightful. No two organisations are the same, and we won't ask two organisations to do it in the same way. You'll know from doing it. I'll chuck loads of questions at you. So why have you done that? And what would you do if this happened?
Yeah, yeah, it is a process. It's a very thorough process, but it is a very good way of, looking inside, right, of the organization and be like, what are we doing? Are we doing the best that we could be doing to support, as you say, clients, customers, in our case, also the practitioners, our employees themselves. And I think what you said there is really key in terms of like, how do you adapt that organization by organization? Because as you say, there isn't one rule book for this. It really depends on what does your organization do, and what are the touch points there, and how can you sort of influence them and support them. You must end up knowing a lot about different companies in terms of what they do and how they do it and how they work, and you must get to see like really under the hood of what goes on, so that must be really interesting.
Yeah, seeing how differently people interpret things as well and what people have got in place. And I don't know if you've found this or not, but hopefully, people do find it quite a positive experience as well as they're going through the different competencies, and they sort of realize, oh, actually, we do that really well. Um, and also, tweaking things and looking at areas for development. But people find it quite a nice affirmative process a lot of the time.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think if there were any areas that we needed to work on, as you said, there's no time limit, but we obviously Urban holds itself to a very high standard, and we want to make sure that we are doing as much. And we're not finished. Like, just
Yeah,
because we've done this doesn't mean that we can sit back now and, that's not it. We will continue to work on all of our initiatives and make sure that the world is changing, the way that people interact is changing, the way that people get around things is changing. So we need to make sure that we are ahead of it and adapting it and educated on it.
yeah,
That's just a little.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, keep evolving. Don't be complacent, and keep getting that feedback from everyone you work with. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, perfect. And one of the points that you mentioned earlier was about speaking about sexual harassment and assault and rape. And I think one of the challenges when it comes to calling out that behavior and reporting the unacceptable behavior is being able to define it and be able to identify it. So we've defined sexual harassment as any behavior that makes someone feel distressed, uncomfortable, or intimidated. This can then be further broken down within 3 categories that we've identified as verbal, visual, and physical. We then differentiate between assault and harassment, and we categorize harassment as the broader term for a whole group of inappropriate behaviors that would breach civil laws, whereas a sexual assault is more specific and is usually a criminal offense. We also define and refer to personal boundaries, which can be physical, emotional, professional, and social. When we refer to respecting personal boundaries, it's in the context of sexual harassment. So we refer to any behavior that's distressing, uncomfortable, or intimidating, even in subtle or small ways. Why would you advise that it's really important to be able to name and identify those behaviors?
So a big part of having a trauma-informed workplace is having this safe and supportive environment. I think in terms of setting boundaries and creating that safe environment, having those definitions makes it very clear what isn't acceptable and that it will be taken seriously. I like that you've got that emphasis on how it makes someone else feel, so that can't be disputed. You can't dismiss or minimize something that's happened. If it has upset someone or made them uncomfortable, then it fits that definition. And I think in terms of the person who's experiencing it, it helps to reassure them that what they've experienced is valid and recognised. You've got a clear definition that emphasises that even the small things are included, and that will give people confidence to call it out or to report it. I mean, we know from everything in the news that bullying, harassment, particularly sexual harassment in the workplace, is very rarely reported. And reasons for that include sort of fear of being blamed, thinking they won't be believed, it's being part of culture in the workplace, fearing they'll lose their job, knowing nothing will be done about it. And there's so many examples of toxic workplace cultures where harassment and assault are passed off as banter. I hate that word. And normalized. So being clear, like you are, on what constitutes harassment really helps emphasize that actually, no, it's unacceptable and it will be taken seriously. So, I mean, hopefully that will make a person less likely to do it in the first place. But also it'll make others more likely to call it out. It'll make victims more likely to report it. And at the end of the chain, it'll make it easier for management to take strong action and impose proper sanctions as well. So you've got it laid out from the start.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's really important. We're currently calling it know the line. So
Right.
there is a line. And even if it's, and I think for too often we see people say, oh, it was just a comment, it was just this, it was just that. these things add up, but also it's pushing
Yeah.
that line, and it's pushing that boundary, and it's trying to understand where's your boundary. So if we clearly define from the outset what we call it a zero tolerance, the zero tolerance of what? So the reason why we are super clear in terms of our definitions is because we want to show that line. You know, I can't physically show you my boundaries right now, but if I could draw a line, this is the line. Any small, subtle ways that make me feel uncomfortable should be reported and dealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of sort of reporting that to you within the company, however small it seems, you might have received other reports as well, and it's helping you, sorry, to build up a picture of someone's behaviour and things that need to be challenged.
Exactly, exactly. And that's also what we do with the Metropolitan Police is we report, you know, everything and anything just so that they can then build their, as you mentioned, a case based on small incidents that actually then add up to a larger case. Perfect. Okay, so if we move on to sort of more of the trauma, you mentioned sort of that re-triggering. Could you explain how secondary trauma is defined and why it's important to be aware of this impact?
Yeah. So secondary trauma is where someone effectively re-experiences that traumatic event, whether that's consciously or unconsciously. So you mentioned the word trigger. So anything can be a trigger, anything in the present moment. And when that happens, it can transport someone back to that traumatizing experience, and they will relive it with all the same emotions and the physical responses that they experienced the first time. So it's not just remembering something, it's effectively experiencing it. Um, no matter what the context is of the current trigger, it
Mm.
feels exactly like the first original trauma. So it's a massive thing. Um, and it can be caused by all sorts of triggers and stressors. Smell, sound, what someone looks like, a physical space, lighting, um, memory, relationships, anything can be a trigger. However strange that might seem to someone else, it can be literally anything. And it can happen years after the original traumatic event as well. Symptoms can resurface suddenly without warning almost. So I think most people know about post-traumatic stress disorder, but that is what that is. That is secondary trauma. It's reliving the trauma through these intrusive, distressing recollections of the event. You've got symptoms like flashbacks, being easily startled, increased anxiety, increased emotional arousal in general, trouble sleeping, irritability, trouble concentrating, being jumpy, being on constant alert, being unable to trust people. I mean, there's so many different symptoms. Obviously, it varies according to the different person.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very serious thing. It's not just a memory. It's almost re-experiencing that event again.
And I think what you said there about sort of the unconscious or conscious, you know, triggering, I think that's something that, again, in terms of being trauma informed, is something that we all need to work on in terms of recognizing that you know, as much as I would never want to or potentially be a trigger, there could be a behavior that I have or a comment that I make that could trigger someone back to a traumatic event. And, you know, I think in terms of what you mentioned, you know, interactions previously when it comes to it being an appointment with the NHS or similar, in the setting of a one-to-one interaction, if you've noticed that someone starts to show signs of feeling uncomfortable, it, you know, possibly because of there's a trigger there, it could be completely unintentional, completely unconscious based on your behavior, whether it's your actions or your words. Why is it important to be able to recognize those early signs and adjust your behavior accordingly?
Basically, we don't want to exacerbate that trauma for that person, and we don't want to risk re-traumatization. So, just to explain that a bit, there's a difference between experiencing a trigger and experiencing that trauma again as re-traumatization. So, if someone experiences that trigger and has a flashback, for example, um, that that is one incident. When re-traumatization happens, that becomes a trauma in itself, if that makes sense. And so it becomes an additional stressor, an additional traumatic incident in its own right. So by stopping whatever behaviour or whatever it is that has triggered the initial reaction, we can hopefully avoid re-traumatization. Um, and it, like you said, it's likely to be something that we're unaware of. So it could be something we've said, something we've done, but it might be something about the environment as well. Like I said before, it really affects people differently. So it's not about feeling guilty, feeling bad about what we've done. It's just about recognizing that something's wrong and trying to make that change. We can't be an expert in anyone else's trauma, but what we can do is try and communicate with them, be non-judgmental, and work with them to find a way forward. So it's about sort of asking them what they would like us to do differently, accept how they're feeling, give them a choice, signpost to the support that's available as well. And going forward, being aware of our language, being aware of our behaviour, being
Presence as
aware of the
well.
physical environment as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that'd be amazing. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time today.
Okay.
If any of our viewers did want to, educate themselves on safeguarding or any of the topics covered today, it's the website is the right place to go.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's all the information on there. Safeguarding in particular as well. There's one of our members, the Anne Craft Trust. They have loads of info on safeguarding and they do training as well. So they're another good source.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.